It was the porcelain and the pretense that always hit me first. Every year, Thanksgiving at my parents' home in Boston was a meticulously curated stage, less a family gathering and more a high-stakes performance for a non-existent audience. White damask tablecloth, heirloom silver polished until it hurt your eyes to look directly at it, and a centerpiece that looked suspiciously like a floral arrangement featured in the latest issue of Architectural Digest. This year was no different, yet I felt a shift, a cold pressure settling over my shoulders the moment I stepped over the threshold. My sister, Taylor, was already near the fireplace, basking in the warm glow of an artfully placed spotlight, whispering to her new husband, Ryan. Taylor, the golden child, the centerpiece, the one whose life was the script everyone else was expected to follow. I, Chloe, was merely a supporting cast member, there to fill a seat and, ideally, not make any noise. I took my place at the dining table, right across from Taylor, who carefully avoided my gaze. She didn't need to look at me. She knew exactly where I was in the pecking order. Dinner started and the old script began to play. It was an uninterrupted highlight reel of Taylor's recent September wedding. The 400-person guest list, the custom-designed gown flown in from Italy, the venue change because the original one wasn't grand enough, and the connections made with important people. My mother, Eleanor, narrated every detail, her voice high and bright, ensuring no one missed a single moment of Taylor's triumph. My father, Robert, poured wine with a mechanical intensity, his eyes already tired, perhaps from the sheer weight of maintaining this facade year after year. Not a single person asked about my life, my work analyzing environmental data in Seattle, or the huge, silent changes that had occurred in my world since I last saw them. They were present only for the narrative they had constructed. I watched the cranberry sauce being passed, the steam rising from the turkey, feeling detached, as if I were viewing a poorly written play from the cheap seats. For years I had accepted this. I had swallowed the bitterness, laughed off the casual jabs, and faded into the background, believing that was my designated role in the family structure. But 6 months of genuine, unconditional love had hardened my resolve. I was no longer the quiet teenager whose achievements were overshadowed by a headshot needing better light. Then came the inevitable moment, the climax of the first act. My mother, having finished her glowing summary of Taylor's matrimonial spectacle, tapped her water glass with a fork, the sound echoing sharply in the momentary lull. She smiled, her eyes twinkling with that familiar, predatory warmth she reserved for moments of public scrutiny. She didn't look at Taylor because Taylor's box was checked. She looked directly at me. "Sister's wedding was absolutely divine," she announced to the room, her voice a little too loud, ensuring everyone within earshot was paying attention. "Ryan is such a wonderful catch." "So, Chloe," she paused, letting the silence magnify the implied question, "when is your big day?" We're all dying for some good news after such a successful year for the family. A few distant cousins chuckled politely. My father froze, the carving knife momentarily suspended over the turkey carcass, like a prop in a dramatic tableau. Taylor, across from me, remained utterly still, eyes fixed on her plate, a small, knowing smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. That stillness, that careful lack of reaction, was the only tell I needed. She knew exactly what was coming, and she was waiting for me to blush, to stutter, to retreat into the background as always, but I didn't. I slowly, deliberately set my fork down on the edge of my plate. The delicate chime of silver on china was louder than it had any right to be. I met my mother's gaze, not with defiance, but with a bone-deep, quiet finality. "I already had mine, Mom," I said, my voice steady, carrying just enough volume to cut through the heavy air. 6 months ago, actually. The reaction was immediate and visceral. It was the sound of a record scratching to a halt. The room dropped into a vacuum of silence, so profound it felt physical, like the atmosphere had been suddenly sucked out. My mother's perfectly manicured smile collapsed, her face crumpling into confusion and genuine shock. My father's hand, the one holding the knife, trembled slightly. Ryan stared at me, his eyes wide, looking at his wife, Taylor, then back at me, calculating. But it was Taylor's face that held the real shock, not surprise at the news, but panic that her perfectly constructed timeline was being destroyed, and why Dad was the first to speak, his voice a strained whisper, barely audible over the ringing in my own ears. We never got them, Chloe. We never got any invitations. The familiar lie, the rehearsed deflection, the automatic protection of the family's carefully crafted narrative. I took a breath, letting the years of hurt, the decades of being overlooked, settle into a cold, hard clarity in my chest. I figured you'd say that, I replied softly, a gentle tone that belied the bomb I was about to drop. But you see, I made sure you did. You all got invitations, with a signature required upon delivery. I reached into the small clutch bag resting beside me and placed my phone on the crisp, white tablecloth. The screen glowed, reflecting the flickering candlelight like a cold, bright blade. Every eye in the room, mother, father, sister, brother-in-law, and even the stunned cousins, locked onto that screen that I knew this was the moment. The line I had never crossed, the boundary I had never dared to draw. This was the moment I stopped allowing my life to be edited and erased by their convenient forgetfulness. This was the moment I stopped begging for a place at their table and instead built my own. As I tapped the screen to open the evidence, the truth, heavy and undeniable, finally surfaced. Ready to change the narrative forever, this was no longer just a Thanksgiving dinner. It was a confrontation, 6 months in the making. And the next move, the next piece of evidence, was going to be the most shocking detail of all, proving that their forgetfulness was something far more deliberate and far more cruel. The silence that followed my quiet declaration wasn't the kind that implied thought or concern. It was the sharp, physical silence of a sudden impact. Before I pressed play on the truth I held in my hand, I had to travel back, because to understand the damage, you have to understand the flawed foundation upon which the family was built. It wasn't malice, not at first. It was a worship of symmetry and optics. Growing up in our large, historic Boston home, I learned early that my family, Mom Eleanor especially, loved things that fit neatly together. Perfect photo albums, perfectly manicured lawns, perfect milestones to report to the country, club members. Our lives weren't lived, they were curated. And in every single frame of that picture-perfect existence, my younger sister, Taylor, was the star. Taylor was the perfect narrative thread. She was 2 years younger, blonde, effervescent, and magnetically dramatic. Everything that looked good under the bright lights of our parents' expectations. From her first dance recital to her captaincy of the cheer squad, her life was a continuous, publicly celebrated ascent. A showroom collection, as the video mentioned. My mother didn't just support Taylor. She managed her career like a luxury brand. Dance classes, college prep, the right internships, it was all meticulously structured for public consumption. A whole gallery of Taylor's awards lined the hallway, professionally framed, with custom spotlights. I wasn't bitter, not as a kid. I genuinely thought that was just how families functioned. One child shined, the other provided the contrast. I was the steady shadow, the quiet observer. My own moments, a regional science fair ribbon for my hydrology project, an early acceptance letter to a great state school, my meticulous work ethic, were met with polite, distracted smiles. "That's lovely, Chloe," Mom would say, already glancing toward Taylor. "But could you hold off on the celebration? I need good light for Taylor's new headshot for the drama club edition." It was never hostile. It was just prioritization. It felt like standing outside a bright window, perpetually on the wrong side of the glass, by the time we hit our teens. This pattern wasn't a phase. It was the very structure of our family. A system. I didn't break it. I adapted. I got unervingly good at watching, learning, and anticipating the emotional needs of the household so I could maneuver around them. I became the silent survivor, the one who navigated life's challenges without ever requesting assistance or attention, because I knew the resources were finite and already allocated to Taylor. If I needed help with a complex college application essay, I found a library resource. If I needed emotional support after a difficult breakup, I learned to lean on my own resilience. It was a lonely lesson, but it forged a strong, quiet independence within me. The move to Seattle for my job wasn't an act of rebellion, though my mother tried to frame it that way to her friends. "Chloe is so independent," she'd sigh dramatically, implying I was too much trouble to manage. For me, it was oxygen. It was a literal escape from the suffocating atmosphere of conditional love and constant comparison. Leaving Boston, leaving the architecture of their symmetry behind, allowed me to start breathing air that didn't feel pre-filtered by their expectations. I built my life 3,000 miles away. A small apartment with tall windows overlooking the city rain, stacks of complex environmental research notes everywhere, and the smell of strong coffee made by Ethan every morning. My job, analyzing water and environmental data, might not have been dazzling enough for my mother's cocktail party chatter, but it was important. It made sense to me. It addressed a real problem in the world, and for the first time, my work mattered for its substance, not its appearance. This newfound space and purpose had been slowly healing the old wounds. I was finally an individual, not a contrast. Yet the deep, old scar of rejection was still sensitive. And that's why months ago, when I decided to marry Ethan, a tiny, stubborn voice inside me still hoped. Hoped that the distance, the time, the sheer magnitude of the life event would finally be enough to make them look up, to shift their focus, if only for a single day. That's why I was sitting here now, in the chilling silence of their staged dining room, with the scent of turkey and denial heavy in the air. Dad's whisper, "We never got them," was the trigger. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was the latest, most painful iteration of the same old script. We never got them because they weren't important enough to receive. But this time I had a counterscript, armed with receipts, timestamps, and a quiet strength forged over years of observation. I looked at the phone on the table. It was the antithesis of their perfect, curated world. It was raw evidence, digital truth. And as my fingers hovered over the screen, ready to dismantle the architecture of their perfect family symmetry piece by painstaking piece, I knew that no matter the cost, I was done living in the shadows. The confrontation wasn't just about the wedding. It was about every science fair ribbon, every overlooked moment, and every time I had been told, implicitly, to wait for better light for my sister's sake. The silence in the room was begging for a lie, but I was ready to deliver the unvarnished, shocking truth. And that truth was about to point directly across the table. The moment my father, Robert, finished his strained denial, "We never got any invitations," I knew this was the point of no return. His voice carried the familiar, protective tone, the one that always sought to smooth over the rough edges of reality, especially when Taylor's perfection was at stake. For decades, their entire emotional geometry had depended on this triangulation. Taylor as the luminous center, Mom Eleanor as the enthusiastic curator, and Dad as the silent enabler, the one who poured the wine and carved the turkey, mechanically supporting the narrative. My role as the satellite was to orbit quietly and never disrupt the system's delicate balance. I could feel the pressure of everyone's eyes on me, waiting for the old Chloe to emerge, the one who would awkwardly laugh, retreat, apologize for the inconvenience, and let the conversation slide back to Taylor's extravagant honeymoon plans. That was the Chloe they expected, the one they had successfully trained to prioritize their comfort over her own pain. But that person had died somewhere between the Boston suburbs and the clear, rain-washed air of Seattle. The silence expanded, not like empty space, but like a slowly spreading leak, seeping into every corner of the room. It was the same silence that had followed my wedding, the silence that had grown heavier, more intentional, over the past 6 months. At first, I had tried to rationalize it. I told myself the classic stories we use to protect ourselves from the truth. They're busy. The mail got mixed up. They're planning a surprise. But the rationalizations began to crumble quickly. A week after the wedding, I tried calling my mother, direct to voicemail. I messaged Dad, a polite, detached reply, "I'll call later," which, as expected, never came. The worst blow was the family group chat, the one we'd used for years since I was in college. One night, while casually scrolling, I noticed my name was gone. I hadn't been removed with a dramatic flourish or an announcement. I had been erased quietly, a digital excision as clean and cold as a surgeon's cut. I was no longer a part of the daily communication loop. When I mentioned it to Ethan while we were doing the dishes, trying to sound casual, my voice cracked on the word glitch. He stopped drying his hands, looked at me, truly looked at me, and asked the simple, devastating question, "Kat, do they ever respond to the invitations at all?" I shook my head. Not even once. Ethan didn't accuse or push. He simply said, "Let's check the logs." That's Ethan. Practical, grounded, a man who deals in facts and data. Together, we navigated the labyrinth of digital history. And there it was, the access logs for the family's shared email account. The original wedding announcement email, sent with love and vulnerability, was flagged. It had been opened from the family's IP address, then permanently deleted and archived. The timestamp was undeniable. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a glitch. This was an active, deliberate act of sabotage. Someone in this house had gone out of their way to ensure my message, my major life event, was never seen. The person who did it quickly came into focus. I could practically see Taylor in my mind's eye, standing in the kitchen, flipping through the mail, controlling the flow of information like a meticulous gatekeeper. She had always been the one mom Eleanor trusted with the appointments, the one dad Robert asked to sort the bills. If a message passed through that household, it had to pass through Taylor first. She had the key to the castle, and she decided what was worthy of interruption. The more I thought, the more the pieces clicked into a chilling alignment. Taylor was preparing for her own massive, 400-guest, September wedding, the grand production Mom Eleanor had always dreamed of. Taylor's identity was completely wrapped up in the spotlight. My quiet, intimate June wedding, even 3,000 miles away, had the potential to draw a sliver of attention away from hers. And Taylor never, ever shared the spotlight easily. The geometry of our relationship dictated that only one of us could shine. But I needed concrete proof, not just a gut feeling reinforced by access logs. So I pulled up the tracking receipts I had meticulously saved, a habit born from a lifetime of having my reality questioned, for separate packages, for distinct signatures. My name as the sender, their Boston address as the destination, and the signature at the bottom of the first receipt. I recognized the familiar, looping cursive instantly. Taylor's signature. It was a punch to the gut. She hadn't forgotten them. She hadn't misplaced them. She had intercepted them. She had signed for them, brought them into the house, and ensured they never made it to my parents' eyes. She had actively buried my wedding. Ethan held me that night, his arm gentle on my shoulder. "Chloe, what do you want to do?" he asked. I didn't have an answer then. The usual rush of anger was absent, replaced by a cold, sharp, and achingly familiar wound of rejection. What do you do when the people you love consciously choose to erase you? The answer came with the approach of Thanksgiving. I nearly skipped it, nearly let them win the war of silence and pretense. But that pretending was what had built this toxic mess in the first place. So I chose a different path. I went back to Boston, and I carried the truth, meticulously documented, with me. I was done being the silent victim of their conditional love. And now, as my father finished his weak denial, all the years of observed evidence were about to explode in the center of their pristine dining room. My decision to leave Boston and move across the country wasn't a sudden whim. It was a slow, deliberate act of self-preservation. In the emotional drought of my childhood home, I had been surviving on the fumes of my own quiet resilience. Moving 3,000 miles west to Seattle was the moment I opened the tap to real, life-sustaining air. I often called it my true north, a place where the compass of my life finally pointed toward me, not toward the gravitational pull of my sister's orbit. I landed in Seattle not with grand ambitions for fame or wealth, but for the profound luxury of anonymity and purpose. I chose a career that was built on objective truth and verifiable data, an environmental data analyst specializing in watershed quality. My job involved sifting through complex environmental metrics, analyzing the health of rivers and coastal areas. It was meticulous, demanding, and utterly removed from the superficial concerns of the Boston social scene my mother chased, i.e. Seattle. There were no expectations for me to be anything other than competent and kind. My office wasn't waiting for a press release about my latest achievement. They were waiting for the actionable data that would protect a vulnerable ecosystem. This work mattered in a deeply tangible way. It made sense to me. It required critical thinking and quiet focus, skills I had honed over years of observing my family's chaotic emotional landscape. For the first time, the skills I possessed were being valued for their utility, not their ability to serve as a backdrop for Taylor's brilliance, and my apartment reflected this newfound clarity. It was small on the third floor of an old building with tall, bright windows that let in the soft, misty Pacific Northwest light. There were stacks of research notes and technical manuals everywhere, a delightful mess that was organized according to my own internal logic. The shirts in my closet smelled faintly of strong coffee and the salty air from the nearby Puget Sound, a scent that was miles away from the expensive and used perfume and polished mahogany of my childhood home. It was here in this quiet, factual world that I began to understand what unconditional presence felt like. And then there was Ethan that I met him at a technical conference. He was a software engineer specializing in building visualization tools for large data sets, a perfect complement to my work. Where I collected and analyzed the numbers, he built the elegant systems to tell their story. Our connection wasn't a sudden, cinematic spark. It was the slow, comfortable alignment of two complex systems finding their perfect operational frequency. Ethan saw me. That simple statement means everything. He didn't see the quiet daughter of the wealthy Boston family, or the sister of the famous socialite. He saw Chloe. He saw the meticulous scientist, the loyal friend, the woman whose sense of humor was dry as dust but unexpectedly sharp. He listened. He paid attention. He remembered things. Not the big, public things, but the small, specific details. My preference for dark roast coffee, the name of the river I was currently analyzing, the slight hesitation in my voice when I talked about going home for the holidays. He remembered the hesitation, and he respected it. His family, the Parkers, noticed me too, but not because I performed for them. They noticed me because they cared. The first time Ethan's mother, Helen, hugged me, she didn't let go immediately, the way my mother did, as if checking a required box. Helen held me, warm and certain. A deep, genuine embrace that felt like a download of acceptance. She asked about my work, and unlike my mother, she remembered the specifics of my environmental studies, following up on a research paper I'd mentioned months before. Ben, Ethan's father, was the same. They weren't flawless people, but they were present. And for me, that was entirely new and profoundly healing. That it was with Ethan and his family that I learned the difference between being loved and being validated. My Boston family loved me conditionally as long as I fit neatly into their geometric structure. Ethan and his family simply validated my existence, my efforts, and my worthiness, no strings attached. This genuine validation was the foundation upon which I finally began to build a life free from the suffocating pressure of Eleanor and Robert's expectations. It was this profound sense of peace and true partnership that made the events of the last 6 months so brutally clear. When Ethan proposed on a foggy June morning by the water, quiet, perfect, real, I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. We both knew we didn't want a grand production. We chose a small, historic chapel on the Nantucket coast, a place of quiet beauty. We invited only the people who truly knew us, keeping everything simple and focused on the truth of our commitment. The plan was flawless, the love was real. Yet, even with this solid foundation, the ghost of my past still whispered. The one small, stubborn wish I carried was the hope that my parents and Taylor would finally, for once, show up, that they would choose me. That tiny, lingering desire for a familial benediction was the last vestige of the old Chloe, the one who still desperately craved their acceptance. And that desire, that tiny, vulnerable opening, was the exact point Taylor chose to attack. But this time, armed with my true life and Ethan's support, the attack would fail. The silence that followed the invitations was a familiar wound. But this time I had the resources, the data, the logs, the receipts, to finally prove the truth of its intentional cruelty. The moment Ethan proposed, everything crystallized. It wasn't a spectacle. It was authenticity wrapped in a thick June fog. We were out by the water in West Seattle, watching the cargo ships drift silently against the gray backdrop. He didn't kneel. He simply turned, took my hand, and in a voice thick with emotion said, "I don't need a grand gesture, Chloe. I just need you. Forever." That was the grandest gesture I could have ever asked for. A promise of presence that I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, the word coming out firm and true. It was the easiest decision of my life, a decision that felt entirely mine, uncontaminated by any external pressure or expectation. We immediately agreed. No white satin, no 5-figure designer dress, and certainly number 400-person gala designed to impress strangers. We wanted real. We wanted simple, that we chose a small, picturesque coastal chapel on Nantucket, a location that felt symbolically halfway between our current life and my Massachusetts roots, a final, hopeful olive branch. We would keep the guest list intimate, inviting only the people who had truly supported us. Ethan's family, a few close friends from college, and our colleagues. The focus was on the commitment, the love, and the joy of two lives finally aligning. Not on the spectacle. IT was in the meticulous planning of this intimate day that my own deeply embedded family issues resurfaced. I told myself I was over their rejection, that I was done seeking their approval. Yet, quietly, stubbornly, a tiny seed of hope took root. Maybe this time. Maybe a wedding, the ultimate family milestone, would finally compel Mom, Dad, and Taylor to see me as a real, whole person, worthy of their focus. This hope manifested in an obsessiveness that even Ethan found unusual. I insisted on designing the invitations myself, a clean, elegant, understated card that contrasted sharply with the gaudy, embossed monstrosities Taylor was planning for her own wedding later that year. And then came the critical choice, the delivery method that I knew my family's habits. I knew their gift for misplacing anything that wasn't immediately useful or aligned with their current focus. A college acceptance letter from a good but not Ivy League school? Misplaced. A scientific achievement award? Never displayed. I had been taught implicitly that if something didn't serve Taylor's narrative, it simply didn't exist at SO. I went military grade on the mailing. I had them printed early, and I mailed 4 separate packages. One for my parents, one for Taylor and Ryan, and 2 others for aunts and uncles who lived nearby, all addressed to the Boston home. Crucially, every single one was sent via priority mail with signature required. I paid the exorbitant fee, not for insurance, but for proof. I triple-checked the addresses. I refreshed the tracking numbers like it was a sacred ritual. I needed that digital paper trail. I needed that official stamp of delivered and accepted when the tracking information updated across the board, delivered. Signature obtained. I finally allowed myself to exhale a shaky, 6-month-long breath I'd been holding since the proposal. I let myself believe, just for a moment, that the barrier had been breached. Then came the silence and, congratulatory texts. No frantic calls from Mom, demanding to know why she wasn't consulted on the seating chart. Not even a casual "congrats" in the family group chat that still technically existed, though I was slowly being faded out of it. It was a vacuum of recognition. Weeks passed. The wedding day came and went, a perfect, deeply felt ceremony surrounded by the people who truly loved us. And still nothing. No acknowledgement, no apology for missing it, no curious inquiry that I began to cycle through the excuses again, the old defense mechanisms kicking in. Maybe the mail was genuinely lost. Maybe they were planning a huge, belated surprise. But deep down, the cold, hard logic of my scientific mind took over. For separate packages, for unique signatures, a fully tracked, verified delivery. This wasn't a postal error. This was intentional. The silence didn't just sit there. It metastasized. It expanded, seeping into every corner of my life like a slow, toxic leak. I started trying to reach out, sending careful, non-confrontational texts that went unanswered. The day I noticed my name was truly gone from the group chat, replaced by an empty space where I used to be, the truth hit me with the force of a tidal wave. They hadn't accidentally forgotten me. They had actively, systematically chosen to erase me. The realization was terrifying, but it was also liberating. It meant the fight was over. I didn't need to try anymore. But the question remained, how? How could 4 signature-required invitations, physical proof, simply disappear without a single word? That was the mystery that Ethan and I solved together, using data and logs, tracing the betrayal back to its single, unmistakable source. That source, the person responsible for the surgical strike against my happiness, was waiting for me across the Thanksgiving table. radiating an artificial calm that only reinforced my certainty. I was returning to Boston, not to beg for forgiveness, but to deliver the verdict. The hope was gone, replaced by a clarity that was infinitely more powerful. The stage was set for the final, shocking exposure. The intentionality of the silence was what finally pushed me past grief into a cold, logical fury. Forgetfulness is human. Coordinated silence is a strategy. After the high of the wedding, a day filled with the real, joyous warmth of the Parkers and our friends, the void left by my family was devastating. It wasn't the absence of their presence that hurt, but the absence of their acknowledgement of my existence. I had tried every gentle approach. A follow-up text to Mom Eleanor. Did you receive the mailer I sent in April? No response. A vague email to Dad, Robert, about checking on a package. Nothing. And then came the digital banishment. The family group chat, my last tenuous link to their daily lives, wiped clean of my name. It was chilling. They weren't just missing my wedding. They were pretending I didn't exist in the digital sphere, creating a perfectly scrubbed version of their family life for themselves. I was discussing it with Ethan one evening, my frustration turning into genuine distress. I was cycling through possibilities. Did the post office commit a mass felony? Did my entire family develop collective amnesia? Let's stop guessing and start analyzing, Ethan suggested, his voice calm and grounded. You're a data analyst, Chloe. We follow the logs. The idea was simple, but groundbreaking to me. We started with the family's main email account. For years, Mom Eleanor had used a generic, shared address for major communications, and Taylor, as the gatekeeper, had managed the password. Ethan, who works in cybersecurity, helped me navigate the complex world of email access logs, something I would never have done alone. We needed the IP addresses and device IDs that accessed the account in April, when I had sent the final digital wedding announcement, and there it was. The needle in the digital haystack. The wedding announcement email was sent at 11:32 a.m. on April 19th. The access log showed a sign-in at 11:34 a.m., originating from an IP address associated with my parents' Boston home. The key detail: the email was opened, read for exactly 48 seconds, and then the log showed an immediate, irreversible action. Permanently deleted and cleared from trash. This wasn't accidental. This required multiple clicks and confirmation. It was a cold, calculated scrubbing of my message. The log also recorded the device ID used for the deletion. It wasn't my father's desktop or my mother's tablet. It was a newer generation smartphone, one I recognized from pictures Taylor frequently posted on social media. The evidence was damning. Taylor had not only intercepted the message, she had ensured it was wiped from the family's digital history. The ghost of a doubt I had clung to, that maybe the post office had failed, vanished. The crime was internal. This wasn't an act of forgetfulness. It was an act of sabotage. But why? The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a horrifying image of familial jealousy. Taylor's wedding, the grand, highly publicized September event, was her ultimate spotlight moment. My quiet, intimate June wedding, even one 3,000 miles away, represented a subtle competition, a diversion of energy. Taylor's entire self-worth was built on being the one and only center of attention. She couldn't risk anyone mentioning my wedding before hers, couldn't risk Mom Eleanor's focus shifting for even a moment. The motive was clear: erase Chloe's timeline to protect Taylor's narrative. But the physical evidence was still the most crucial: the signature-required packages. I pulled up the receipts I had saved on my personal cloud drive, for tracking numbers, for confirmations, I zoomed in on the scanned proof of delivery documents. Package 1, signed by Taylor. Package 2, signed by Taylor. Package 3, signed by Taylor. Package 4, signed by Taylor. The looping, confident signature I knew so well, the one that adorned every card and gift tag in the house, was there 4 times over. She hadn't forgotten to check the mail. She hadn't missed one package. She had systematically signed for all 4 invitations, brought them into the house, and then, presumably, destroyed them. It was a surgical, complete interception that I stared at the screen, the weight of decades pressing down on me. She had signed a legal document acknowledging receipt of my most sacred news, only to bury it. It was the moment I realized the depth of the deception and the extent of my parents' negligence in fostering such a toxic environment. They had trained Taylor to be a star, and now she was using that star power to eliminate competition, even if that competition was her own sister's quiet happiness. Ethan sat beside me, his arm wrapped around me. "Kat," he said, using his pet name for me. "She didn't just miss your wedding. She intercepted it. What now?" Rage would have been easy. Crying would have been familiar. But what settled over me was a profound, cold clarity. I was done with silence. I was done with being erased. The truth, meticulously documented, was my only weapon. Thanksgiving was just days away. I was going back to Boston, not for the meal, but for the final confrontation. I would not let them pretend anymore. The truth, I realized, was the only thing that could truly set me free, even if it meant blowing up the perfect symmetry of their family dinner table forever. I was ready to use the evidence Ethan and I uncovered to deliver a shocking blow that would redefine our entire relationship. The drive from Seattle to Boston, even with a layover, felt less like travel and more like traversing a psychological distance. I wasn't just flying across the country. I was traveling back in time, back into the suffocating atmosphere of my parents' home. The closer the plane got to Logan Airport, the tighter the old, unspoken tension settled over my shoulders, familiar and heavy, like a lead-lined coat I had never asked to wear. Ethan couldn't come with me this time. He had a major project launch scheduled, but his quiet support was my armor. "Just remember what you're fighting for, Chloe," he'd said at the airport, holding my hands. "It's not about them showing up. It's about you demanding that they see the truth. You don't need their validation anymore." But a small part of me still felt the primal pull of expectation. I carried the phone, my weapon of truth, in my clutch, every receipt and log meticulously organized. Stepping into the house was like walking onto a theater stage just as the curtains rose. The scent of pine and expensive roast was in the air. Taylor was already positioned near the mantel, posing for a photo with Ryan, her posture perfected from years of cheer and pageantry. She looked luminous, still basking in the afterglow of her September spectacle. My mother, Eleanor, was predictably hovering over the turkey, narrating Taylor's wedding details to a distant cousin who looked utterly exhausted. Dad Robert was pouring whiskey, his movements precise and mechanical, his eyes already showing the strain of the long day ahead. Not one person asked how I was. Not one person mentioned the wedding they had collectively missed. It was the same old routine, a carefully choreographed dance of neglect. I was simply absorbed back into the backdrop, a shadow that didn't need commentary. I sat down at the table, directly across from Taylor. She didn't acknowledge me, her focus seemingly entirely on arranging her napkin. This was her performance. Utter disinterest, the non-acknowledgement that was always louder than any insult. Silence was Taylor's most effective weapon, and she was a master performer. Dinner commenced. The script flowed seamlessly. Praise for Taylor's custom invitations, her guest list, her connections, the small but important detail that the florist had also done a wedding for a well-known senator. Every sentence was a brutal, glittering reminder that they had shown up for her, enthusiastically and repeatedly, while they had actively erased a single, pivotal day of my life. I ate slowly, savoring the silence between my own ears, preparing my internal monologue. I had endured years of this. I could endure a few more minutes. Then came the moment, the final piece of the theatrical script. Mom, Eleanor, tapped her glass. "Sister's wedding was just magnificent, wasn't it?" she cooed, casting a loving glance at Taylor, who offered a demure, perfect smile. Such a relief to have the planning done. "So, Chloe," she tilted her head, giving me the full weight of her performative attention, "when is your big moment?" "We'd love to have something nice to look forward to next year." The table chuckled, a polite, uncomfortable ripple of sound. My father's carving knife paused. Taylor didn't move. Her eyes remained glued to her plate, her stillness giving away her anticipation of my inevitable, embarrassed surrender. That pause. I felt the familiar burn of the old wound. The instinct to laugh it off, to let the jab slide under my skin, was powerful. But the Chloe who laughed it off was gone. I set my fork down with that deliberate chime, the sound demanding attention. "I already had mine, Mom," I stated, my voice low and level. "6 months ago, back in June. And you all got invitations, signature required." The room went silent, but it wasn't the slow silence of shock this time. It was the sudden, dead quiet of a system short-circuiting. My mother's face went white. My father put the carving knife down, the noise resonating like a hammer blow. Taylor, across from me, looked up, a flicker of pure terror crossing her eyes before she masked it with indignation. Why father? The designated diplomat quickly intervened, clinging to the old script. "We never got any invitations, Chloe. You know, we would have been there if we had." "I know you think you would have," I countered, my voice still gentle but firm. "I know that's the story you tell yourselves. But I came prepared for the denial." My hand dipped into my clutch. Every head leaned in. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a revelation. I wasn't just complaining, I was proving. I was about to drop the shocking truth. This family was built on a lie, and the proof was now glowing on the white tablecloth, waiting to expose the architect of the sabotage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive food and cheap deception, and I was finally ready to clear the air. As I placed my phone on the table, face up, the small, bright screen became the focal point of the entire room. The candlelight caught the glass, giving it a cruel, mirror-like quality that reflected the shocked faces surrounding the turkey. This was the moment of singularity, the instant when the comfortable, rehearsed narrative shattered under the weight of cold, hard evidence. I tapped the screen, opening the folder I had labeled Truth. The first image to fill the screen was the digital proof of delivery receipt from the Postal Service. Priority mail, addressed to Robert and Eleanor in Boston, delivered April 23rd. Beneath the tracking details in a bold digital font was the phrase, "Signature obtained M." Why father leaned forward, squinting, trying to find a flaw, a technicality. This is an automated receipt, Chloe. It doesn't mean anything. Mail gets misdirected, signed for by the wrong person." I didn't argue. I simply zoomed in, rotating the phone so the angle was perfect for everyone at the center of the table. "You're right, Dad," I said, my voice unwavering. "Mail gets signed for, but sometimes you recognize the signature." I pointed directly to the stylized, looping cursive scrawl at the bottom of the receipt, the signature acknowledging receipt of the invitation. That signature, Mom, Dad, Ryan, it belongs to Taylor. The gasp that came from my mother was soft, almost inhaled, as if she were trying to pull the shock back in. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, darting from the screen to Taylor, who was impossibly still rigid and still. My father sat back, the air rushing out of him, his face a mask of dawning horror. Ryan, Taylor's husband, finally moved, stiffening in his chair, his eyes fixed on his wife as if a complete stranger had just materialized in her place. He didn't look angry. He looked utterly, bewilderingly betrayed. Taylor, however, was a masterpiece of control. She finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine for the first time all evening. There was no apology there, only a cold, calculated defiance. "It's a forgery," she snapped, her voice low. "It's a postal error. I sign for packages constantly. I don't remember signing for 4 specific packages from Seattle." "That's a good performance, Taylor," I replied, maintaining my calm, gentle tone. "But that's why I have 4 receipts, not 1. I swiped the screen. "Here's the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th. All signed for by you, Taylor, on the same day. For distinct packages containing 4 separate wedding invitations for 4 sets of relatives. And all intercepted." The word hung in the air, intercepted. It wasn't a mistake. It was a felony of the heart, and my mother, Eleanor, began shaking her head rapidly. No. That makes no sense, Chloe. Taylor would never. She loves you. She was just stressed with her own wedding planning. It must be an oversight. "Stop," I said, not loudly, not with rage, but with a quiet sense of exhaustion and finality. "Mom, you keep saying what Taylor wouldn't do, but you never look at what she actually does." That landed like a physical blow. Eleanor froze, the denial catching in her throat. It was Ryan, Taylor's husband, who finally broke the tension. His voice was low, shaky, stripped of all politeness. "Taylor, did you sign for these?" Taylor blinked, a slow, mechanical movement, like a computer trying desperately to reboot after a system crash. "I don't remember. Maybe I grabbed the mail sometimes. But I didn't see any invitations. I swear I didn't see them." I stayed silent. I had learned a long time ago that silence, when armed with evidence, is louder than any accusation. I let the lie hang in the heavy air, forcing my father to finally speak, his voice hard, directed at his favorite child. "You didn't see 4 packages from your sister," Dad Robert pressed, his confusion giving way to genuine anger. "Around the time you knew she was engaged?" Taylor's composure cracked. "It's not my job to track everyone's mail." She shrieked, the first real crack in her perfect facade. The anger was raw and out of place, a wild, cornered animal reaction. Eleanor reached for her, instinctively trying to smooth things over. "Sweetheart, no. Let her talk, Mom," I interrupted, my voice dangerously calm. "She's been talking for years. Now we're finally listening." Taylor glared at me, her face flushed with fury. "What's that supposed to mean, Chloe?" I didn't answer that question yet. Instead, I swiped the screen to the final, devastating piece of evidence, the email log Ethan helped me access. "This," I said quietly, "is the activity log for the family email account. The digital wedding announcement I sent in April was opened from this house, then deleted immediately with the trash emptied." My father's jaw tightened. "Who has access to that account?" Everyone at the table, especially Taylor, knew the answer. Taylor had always been the designated digital administrator. and as her expression contorted, transforming from cold defiance to absolute terror, I knew the game was finally over. The truth was out, not as my accusation, but as her documented, undeniable action. The presentation of the final evidence, the device ID tied to the immediate deletion of the email announcement, was the knockout blow. Taylor tried to rally. I didn't delete anything. She insisted, too fast, too loud that I tilted my head, my eyes never leaving hers. Then why does the log show your device ID? Your phone. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, struggling for a coherent lie. I might have clicked it by accident. I don't know. Why are you attacking me? The defensive shift was predictable, but I was ready for it. I'm not attacking you, Taylor, I said, meeting her glare. I'm simply showing everyone here what you did. Eleanor, still clinging to the threadbare remnants of her ideal family image, exhaled harshly. Why would Taylor ever hide your invitations? Why would she sabotage your wedding? That's utterly ridiculous, Chloe. There it was. The sentence Eleanor had been polishing my entire life. The defense she had used for every bruise Taylor had ever left on me, whether physical or emotional. She would never. Why? I repeated, savoring the word. Because my wedding happened in June. Hers was in September. That's the simplest, most honest answer. I looked directly at Taylor, bypassing my parents entirely, because you didn't want anyone talking about mine before yours. You couldn't stand the possibility of Mom having to divide her attention. Taylor flinched, as if I had struck her with the raw truth she'd been desperately trying to outrun for months. That's insane. She hissed. You always twist things to make me look bad. You're always the quiet, perfect one who just suffers. No, I corrected, the calmness in my voice making her fury seem brittle. You did that yourself. I'm just providing the documentation. Ryan's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back and stood up, his gaze locked on Taylor. His face was pale, his realization slowly turning to horror. Taylor, is this true? Did you do this? Why didn't you tell me? Taylor stared down at her napkin, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She couldn't look at him, couldn't look at anyone. The carefully constructed wall of her perfection was crumbling, revealing the trembling, jealous core beneath. This is. Everyone always thinks Chloe is so innocent, she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of long-held resentment. She never needs anything. She never wants anything. She ruins nothing for anyone. She just exists and makes everyone feel. She paused, struggling to find the word, the confession she had held inside for decades. Makes everyone feel what, Taylor? I asked, my voice soft, urging the final, crucial truth out of her. She shot up from her chair, her eyes blazing, tears finally spilling down her cheeks in a torrent of raw, unmasked emotion. Makes everyone feel guilty, feel small, feel like she doesn't even have to try to be better than me. Ah, there it was, the real confession, not about the invitations, but about the deep-seated, lifelong jealousy that had festered in the shadow of my quiet achievements. She hadn't hated my lack of success. She hated my capacity for quiet, uncelebrated success. She had been trained to believe that if she wasn't the absolute best, the center of the universe, she was nothing. And my self-sufficient life in Seattle, my quiet, real happiness with Ethan, threatened that belief to its core. I leaned back slightly, absorbing the monumental weight of her words. So, you hid my wedding. I summarized the clarity brutal. Because what? Because it was quiet? Because it didn't compete with your six-tier cake and rented string quartet? You felt threatened by my happiness, so you tried to erase it entirely. Taylor stood there, shaking, unable to form a denial that didn't sound transparently false. The truth was now a thick, suffocating smoke filling the room, and my father, desperate to repair the decade of emotional damage in one sentence, stepped in. Chloe, please. We didn't know. If we'd known, you would have come. I finished for him, the question hanging heavy. After years of missing every quiet milestone, after forgetting every birthday that wasn't celebrated with a catered event, after making sure Taylor's needs always came first, even the need to feel superior. He closed his eyes, defeated. My mother's face twisted in pain. You can't put all that on us, Chloe. We did our best. No, Mom, I stated, my voice finally hardening with conviction. You did your best for Taylor. For me, you did the bare minimum and called it fairness. Taylor sat down abruptly, her shoulders collapsing. Even she, the master manipulator, couldn't defend against that truth. The weight of decades, the pain of being constantly minimized, pressed into my chest, but this time it was not grief. It was glorious, magnificent clarity. I looked at each of them, the people I had silently begged for years to see me, and I finally told them the one truth that mattered, the truth that was the prerequisite for my freedom. I didn't lose my family tonight, I said, my voice cutting through Taylor's sobs. I just stopped pretending I had one. This was the shocking end to the performance they never saw coming. My mother gasped, the sound sharp and wounded. Chloe, don't you dare talk like that, she pleaded, her voice laced with the terror that her life's masterpiece, the illusion of a perfect, loving family, was finally and publicly being defaced. Why, Mom? I challenged, my gaze steady. Because it threatens the story you built? The one where Taylor is the shining star, Dad is the neutral provider, you are the peacemaker, and I'm the problem child who's too independent and too quiet. Dad Robert, his eyes still closed, whispered, No one said you're the problem, Chloe. You didn't need to say it, I replied, the emotion now controlled, precise. You showed it, over and over. You showed it when you let her claim the only family vacation slot for her cheer competition. You showed it when you prioritized her drama club headshots over my college acceptance. You showed it with your silence after she repeatedly gaslit me. And you showed it again when you automatically accepted the lie that the Postal Service lost 4 signature-required invitations. Ryan, Taylor's husband, sank back into his chair, watching the pieces of his marriage and the foundation of the family he married into rearrange themselves into a shape he didn't recognize. He finally understood the toxicity he had unknowingly accepted. Taylor, now hunched over, whispered my name. Chloe, please! That single word. Please. It wasn't an apology. It was a desperate plea for me to stop, to retreat, to let her retain control of the narrative. It carried the weight of years of guilt and the sudden, terrifying realization that her absolute power over me, and perhaps over the family, was gone. That I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a soft, final scrape. I needed to move, to establish physical distance from the emotional debris. I'm done begging for a place at this table, I declared, my voice resonating with a quiet authority that silenced even Taylor's sobs. I'm done asking you to show up for me. I'm done pretending Taylor's choices don't hurt me, or that I don't see the years of subtle, dismissive sabotage. I paused, letting the finality of the statement settle, and I am done accepting your silence as anything but agreement. I took a deep breath, the deepest I had taken all night. I'm done. My father stood too, his instinct to repair overriding his ability to think. He reached out a hand, a desperate gesture. Chloe, don't go. We can talk. We can fix this. We are talking, Dad, I countered, my eyes now brimming with unshed tears, the culmination of 2 decades of suppressed grief. For the first time and for the last time under these terms, you can't fix what you refuse to acknowledge, and you refused for years. My mother's face was twisted in a profound, unfamiliar pain. We can fix this, honey. Tell us what you need. What I needed was an acknowledgement of my existence 5, 10, 15 years ago, I replied, shaking my head. What I needed was for you to hold me like a treasure, not an inconvenience. What I needed was for you to see my wedding as a joy, not a threat to your preferred narrative. You can't put a Band-Aid on a wound this deep. You didn't miss my wedding because of a postal error, Mom. You missed it because you raised a daughter who thought erasing her sister's happiness was a necessary act of self-preservation, and you enabled the environment that allowed it to flourish. The finality of the conversation was exhausting, yet liberating. I walked toward the coat rack in the hall, feeling lighter with every step. My father followed me, the picture of defeated parental regret. We should have checked the mail, he muttered, the regret sounding hollow. We should have asked. It shouldn't have been your responsibility to check, Dad, I said, pulling my coat over my shoulders. It should have been your daughter's responsibility to deliver the truth, and your responsibility to create an atmosphere where she felt safe doing so. Instead, you created a space where only the perfect truth could exist. As I reached the front door, the cold November air rushing in, I heard Taylor's sobs, no longer histrionic, but small and broken. I heard my mother call my name, not as a command, but as a plea that I pause, my hand on the doorknob, turning back for one final, crucial sentence. I needed them to understand the nature of their failure, not just as a missed event, but as a deliberate choice. You didn't miss my wedding, I said, looking them all in the eye, my voice cutting through the heavy air. You chose not to see it. Then I opened the door and stepped out, letting it close behind me. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic slam, but firmly, a clean, final line drawn in the sand. And for the first time in my life, the profound silence that followed belonged entirely to me. It was the silence of freedom, of self-possession, and the terrifying, beautiful silence of a relationship finally being severed in the name of self-worth. The moment the front door closed, sealing me off from the emotional wreckage inside, I felt an almost dizzying sense of lightness. The air in the Boston night was cold and sharp, a profound contrast to the suffocating warmth of the house, and I inhaled deeply, tasting freedom. My legs felt shaky, but my resolve was solid. I had done it. I had faced the truth, demanded recognition, and walked away when it was denied that I didn't have to walk far. Ethan, my anchor, my true north, was waiting. He had parked his rental car around the corner, like a lookout, knowing instinctively that I wouldn't linger. As I rounded the corner, he saw me, and without asking a single question, "No, what happened?" or "Are you okay?" he simply opened the door, stepped out, and wrapped his arms around me. That embrace was everything the last 2 decades hadn't been. It wasn't conditional, it wasn't transactional, and it wasn't checking a box. It was pure, unadulterated presence. He just held me until the deep internal shaking, the residual tremor of confrontation, began to subside. There was no judgment, no need for explanation, only the steady, certain beat of his heart against my ear. That was the essence of our marriage. Silent, profound understanding. The next morning, we drove out of Boston, the city of my conditional past, and headed north. Ethan's parents, Helen and Ben Parker, knew the general outline of the drama, and they offered exactly what I needed, a haven free of ceremony and pity. They invited us to their simple, warm home in Vermont for a quiet, late Thanksgiving breakfast. The atmosphere at the Parkers' table was the antidote to the cold porcelain pretense of my parents' house. There was warm food, simple, real comfort food, genuine conversation, and the kind of attention that didn't have to be earned through performance. Helen sat across from me, pouring coffee, her gaze soft and steady. "You did the right thing, honey," she said, her voice low and firm. That kind of toxic environment, you don't heal in it. You just bleed slower. Ben, Ethan's father, nodded. "You have to choose your family, Chloe. Sometimes the people who share your blood are simply not equipped to give you the love you deserve. You had the courage to step away from the deficit." Then Helen squeezed my hand, her touch warm and certain. This was the moment that truly broke me, far more than the confrontation with my sister. "Your family here, Chloe," Helen declared, looking directly into my eyes. "Not because you married my son, but because you matter. Your work matters. Your heart matters. You are enough, just as you are." It was the acceptance I had always craved, delivered without being asked for, and without any obligation in return. It was the realization that I had spent my entire life trying to fit into a mold that was too small for me, only to discover a vast, welcoming space waiting for me all along. The following week, the silence from Boston wasn't absolute, but the contact was strategic. Taylor sent a long email, carefully worded, clearly influenced by a therapist. It was an apology of sorts, therapy soft, using clinical language to admit to feelings of inadequacy, resentment, and the need for control. She admitted intercepting the packages, framing it as a desperate, irrational act born from the pressure of her own wedding that I read it. I didn't reply, not out of spite, but because her apology was the beginning of her healing journey, and I was no longer responsible for managing it. My own healing required distance that my father, Robert, however, made small, tentative steps. He called every few days. The calls were awkward, strained, but they were his attempts. He didn't discuss the confrontation. He just asked about my job, my current project, small, quiet inquiries into my real life. Then one morning, a small, square, padded envelope arrived in the mail. It was sent priority mail. Inside was a single, slightly crushed item. One of the original June wedding invitations, the elegant cardstock, now slightly faded. Taped to the back was a small, folded note from my father. It was not an apology. It was just one sentence. "Found this in a storage box in the garage." Proof of delivery. That was the closest my father ever came to an authentic, real-world apology. A silent, documented admission of the truth I had forced him to face. He had found the truth, and he had sent it to me, without commentary, simply acknowledging the fact. It was a small, fragile step, but it was real, and my mother, Eleanor, never reached out. And for the first time, that absence didn't feel like a gaping wound. It felt like a definitive answer. I had sought a relationship where I was seen. She had only been capable of offering a performance. And in her final, lasting silence, I found the clarity to let go. I no longer needed her validation. The fight was over, and I had won my life back. The weeks following Thanksgiving were characterized by a quiet, profound healing. It wasn't a sudden, cinematic recovery, but the slow, meticulous process of rebuilding a landscape after a devastating flood. The foundation of my new life with Ethan, built on mutual respect and shared values in Seattle, allowed the healing to take place in fertile ground. I used to believe that family was something you protected, no matter the cost to your own mental health or identity. I had carried the burden of their expectations, their optics, and their emotional deficit for so long that the absence of that weight felt almost destabilizing at first. But Ethan was always there, steady and present, reminding me through his actions that I was safe, seen, and valued. Our apartment became my sanctuary. I began to actively embrace the quiet life I had always led, no longer seeing it as a failing compared to Taylor's noise, but as a strength. My work, analyzing the complex data sets for environmental remediation projects, absorbed me completely. The objective, verifiable truth of the data was a soothing balm after the subjective, emotional chaos of my past. The numbers never lied. They simply told the story of the river's health. The phone calls from my father continued. They were still awkward. He would ask about the specifics of my environmental research, details that would have bored him to tears 6 months ago. He was learning to listen, not just to wait for his turn to speak. I kept the boundaries firm. Our conversations were about my life now, not about Taylor, not about the past drama, and certainly not about my mother. He was on probation, a chance for a new, healthier relationship built on respect, not obligation. He was trying to build a bridge, and I was holding the blueprint. Taylor's email was filed away. I sometimes revisited the tracking receipts and the email logs, not to feel anger, but as a reminder. They were my battle scars, proof of the war I had won. They represented the most shocking and painful realization that my sister's jealousy had been so consuming, so profound, that she was willing to sabotage my happiness to secure her own spotlight. That level of pathological neediness was something I could never fix, only escape. The biggest shift was in my relationship with the Parkers. They didn't replace my family, but they redefined the concept of kinship. They didn't celebrate me for grand achievements. They celebrated me for being. When I successfully completed a challenging hydrological model, Helen didn't immediately ask if I could get the local news to cover it. She baked my favorite cookies and said, "I'm so proud of your dedication." It was the small, consistent validation that slowly eroded the deep-seated belief that I had to perform for love. One evening, Ethan was cooking dinner, spaghetti carbonara, a simple favorite, and the sound of his low humming mixed with the scent of garlic and parmesan. Our friends were due to arrive soon for a spontaneous game night. People we had chosen, people who chose us every single day. I leaned against the counter, watching him, finally understanding the profound difference between the family I was born into and the family I had built. The concept of a successful life, according to my mother, was a highly visible, financially grand, and socially approved checklist. I realized that my quiet life, the stacks of research papers, the small apartment, the husband who truly saw me, the career that made a difference to the planet, was, by my own measure, the most successful thing I could have ever achieved. The confrontation at Thanksgiving was necessary, not for them, but for me. It was my final, painful act of cutting the cord, of reclaiming the value I had allowed them to diminish for so long that I finally understood the truth, a truth that is universally applicable and profoundly humanitarian. Family is not who shares your blood, it is who shows up. It is who listens. It is who stays. The silence of their absence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like peace. It felt like a clean slate. I had walked away from the people who never learned how to hold me. And in doing so, I had finally created the life and the family where I could thrive. The shock of Taylor's betrayal had been the necessary catalyst for my greatest personal victory, the quiet, steady, enduring victory of self-worth. The sun setting over the Olympic Mountains often cast a golden, reflective light across our living room windows in Seattle, and it was in this quiet light that I finally processed the enduring lesson of my confrontation. The drama of that Thanksgiving had been a spectacular, high-stakes exposure, shocking enough to be the climax of any movie. But the true story was in the aftermath, the boring, gentle rhythm of genuine healing. The humanitarian element of my journey, I realize now, lies in the universality of its core conflict, the struggle to define one's own worth outside of parental or societal standards. I was not a victim, but a survivor who finally chose to thrive. The narrative I had fought for, the truth of a life well lived despite being erased, was my legacy, far more valuable than any perfectly curated family photo, and why relationship with my father is slowly evolving. He calls, we talk about the weather and my data projects, and it's a small, fragile start. I maintain the boundaries I set. Respect for my new life or nothing. Taylor, consumed by her own internal battles, remains distant. And Mom Eleanor, the architect of the conditional love, stays silent, a decision I respect, because that silence is finally honest. Standing here in my own home, the quiet buzzing with the energy of a life I built, I understand that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't a confrontation. It was the decision to walk out that door. It was the decision to stop needing the approval that was never coming. The people who truly mattered, Ethan, Helen, Ben, my friends, didn't need a spectacular wedding to see me. They saw me every day. This story, filled with the shocking betrayal of a sister and the heartbreaking failure of parents, ultimately has a deeply rooted, hopeful, and necessary happy ending. It's the kind of happy ending that isn't about reconciliation with the aggressors, but about reconciliation with yourself. I found peace, authenticity, and a true sense of belonging. The family I have now is built on choice, intention, and love, not just genetics I used to carry the weight of being overlooked. Now, I carry the light of being truly seen. That is the victory I claim. For those of you watching, perhaps recognizing fragments of your own story in mine, the lesson I learned is this. Do not let others define your value based on how conveniently you fit into their life's narrative. Your quiet successes, your hard-won peace, and your simple, authentic happiness are infinitely more precious than any public spectacle. If you are struggling with a relationship that requires you to shrink yourself to make others comfortable, remember that the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for your partner is to choose your own oxygen. Sometimes, walking away from the people who never learned how to hold you is the only way to teach yourself how to fly. You are not responsible for their regret, only for your own peace. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between preserving a family illusion and protecting your own self-worth? What was the moment, the signature receipt moment, that finally gave you the clarity to walk away or establish a firm boundary? Share your story in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Your time and attention mean the world, and I truly hope this narrative gives someone the courage they need today. Don't forget to subscribe for more honest stories about navigating the complex roads of life and finding your true north.